Must have been the third or the fourth time I've addressed students here at NYU. I went to NYU briefly after the war under the GI Bill of Rights, and they threw me out for objecting to the poor way they were teaching white history. I didn't expect them to teach black history, but they were teaching white history so poorly it was an insult to me personally, because I knew more than that, and I knew better than that. One of the reasons why the history of most people are out of kilter is that for the last 500 years, the history of the world has really been the history of Europe and its contact with the broader world. All right, now tonight's topic is the African-American background to African history. We don't talk boldly about each other enough. We don't talk honestly about each other enough. And we see ourselves in little pockets like Caribbeans and Trinidadians and Jamaicans and Bajans and North Carolinians and Deltas and AKAs. We see ourselves in little pockets. And we quite forget that some of us left Africa on the same slave ship. And the slave ship stopped off in the West Indies and dropped off some and came over here and dropped off others. And that the slave ship didn't bring any Trinidadians, didn't bring any Jamaicans, didn't bring any West Indians, didn't bring any high yallahs, no low yallahs, no deltas, no AKs, no Masons. Didn't bring any of the things we had to be in order to survive. We had to make an adoption. We had to adapt ourselves to a given condition or perish as a people. Having adopted ourselves to this condition and having taken on some of the values of this condition and having lost some of the values of Africa, we got ourselves into a tremendous trap which frustrates our bid for power at this juncture in history. First, we accepted certain tag names that we are not. First, we are not a minority. Between the Caribbean islands, the United States, and Brazil that has 60 million declared blacks and 20 million trying to make up their mind, you got the largest African nation outside of Africa in Brazil. They have less political muscle than the blacks have in Atlanta, Georgia. All of them put together. Someone told them that they have no problem. And believing that is their problem. They haven't asked themselves, how is it that the bulk of the population of Brazil is either African or part African, and they don't have 3 elected officials? That if they voted properly and brought the pressure properly on the Brazilian government, they could be the masters of Brazil. And one of the reasons they are not the masters of Brazil, that they have been told that Brazil has no color problem. And they haven't asked, if they had no color problem, why is it that I'm on the bottom? Because we haven't asked these essential questions, and we haven't asked the essential questions about the rest of the world. Now, I began this study of the history of African people by studying the Bible and facing the disappointments in the Bible. The Sunday school lessons that was sent from White Baptist Company in Nashville, Tennessee, had everything white. Of all the people who were not European and not white who died, there wasn't one colored angel, no place. I mean, they didn't make it. I began to ask some serious questions about image. 20 years would pass before I would seriously study the role of image and mind control. One of the main reasons why we think the way we do about ourselves, that we have not seen enough of the images of ourselves in the history of the world. We have not seen the image of ourselves in the Bible itself. I asked my then great-grandmother if this is God's book, and she said it was. And if God is love, why did he leave us out of the book? Why didn't I find anybody that looked like us in the book? I see Moses, born in Africa, going down to Ethiopia to marry Zipporah. The Bible gives him one Ethiopian wife. My research gives him 3. So the taste for chocolate was universal and historical. And it's still very prevalent. And it's a compliment. Sometimes the compliment is then poorly used, but it is a compliment. The black woman has been an attraction for the men of the ages, down through the ages. All right, now, my point is that because I wanted to teach Sunday school, I learned to read early. I learned to pronounce the difficult names in the Bible. I was still in some kind of confusion until I wanted to do something nice for my 5th grade teacher, because she was another deity in my life. See, in the South, in current events, when I was growing up, maybe something your parents will tell you about. I doubt if your parents are as old as I am. Every Friday we had current events, and most of the kids would pick out one little item from a local paper. The paper published about 2 items a week on black people, and they were repeated again and again and again. And because I worked for white people who had good libraries, and when I borrowed books to take home, they stopped missing them and I stopped bringing them back. I grew up with literature around me, encyclopedias, taken one by one. So I had bodies of information. They would get magazines and newspapers one day and throw them out the next day. So when I went to speak my little current event piece, I would speak about the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, and the Teapot Dome, and the international things, you know, and scandals of the world, and politics. And so I was a little somebody, plus the fact that I was leader of something we don't talk about in mixed company. I was the leader of the Black Brigade, as against the little middle-class kids we call the Light Brigade. Freaks, ate 3 meals a day and wore shoes all the year round. Strange people, you know. Wasn't too smart in school though, because the Light Brigade beat them out scholastically. But this is something I would write about much later. The main thing is that when I asked one of the white people I worked for about a book on Africans and ancient history, he said that we have. He said, "I'm sorry, John, but you came from a people who have no history." I began to rebel. While doing chores at that high school, Rosenwald High School, that's another lecture, the old Rosenwald High School, when Rosenwald would give, the Rosenwald Fund of Sears and Roebuck would give 1/3, the city would give 1/3, the people would raise 1/3, and you get a school that way. Because we were suspicious of anything white people gave us, we assumed that Sears and Roebuck wanted us to be educated so we can read the Sears and Roebuck catalog and order from that company. That's our rationale. No, nobody gave us anything for nothing. But finally, I read an essay by a person who described himself in his lifetime as a Puerto Rican of African descent. I thought he had a German-sounding name, and only a few years ago, I discovered that the name was Danish. He was from the Danish West Indies, now the American Virgin Islands, named Arthur Schomburg. And his famous essay was called "The Negro Digs Up His Past." Then I began to understand that we are older than our oppressor, older than oppression itself, that we are the world's first people to give the world an organized society, give it a dynasty, give it a appreciable order. And I began to read this history. And when I finally reached Schomburg and asked him, he was on his lunch hour and his staff was out. I wanted to know the history of African people all over the world, henceforth within the hour, his lunch hour. He said, "Sit down, son. What you're calling African history and Negro history is the missing pieces of world history." He told me to go study the history of your masters. Go study the people who stole you from history. I began to study European history. While the 20 years I taught at Hunter College up to the last semester, I nearly always taught African history, or Africa's relationship to the whole world. But with 10 minutes notice, I can teach any aspect of European history. Because I understood through Schomburg, in order to understand the history of Africa, you must understand how African people relate to the whole world. And so I came to New York during the Depression, where I would encounter great black master teachers who would train me for nothing. So I have the great advantage of being trained by black master teachers. From Arthur Schomburg, I learned the interrelationship of our history to the history of the world. From Willis and Huygens, who headed the Old Harlem History Club, I learned I learned the political meaning of history. And from the lectures of William Leo Hansberry of Howard University, I learned the philosophical meaning of history. So coming in from history from all these angles, plus a knowledge of European history, gave me a range in the teaching and the study of history I otherwise would not have. Now, I'm going to begin by mentioning something you could know about. Jesse Jackson's suggestion that we be called Africans. Now, when I heard this suggestion, I sighed with boredom, though I like Jesse Jackson. So what else is new? Black scholars have been talking about this for 200 years. This is nothing new. And there's black scholars who've written, two Caribbean scholars have written good books on it. Richard Moore's work, The Name Negro, Its Origin and Evil Use, and a work written by Raphael Powell, and Raphael Powell is still alive, walking the streets of Harlem, pretending he's not starving. A proud Jamaican, you know, living on Social Security and what else, and a little pittance from being assistant pastor in a local church. But a man with great pride and dignity. His one pressed Palm Beach suit in the summer, his one pressed black suit in the winter, you know, always neatly pressed. But a person with practically no means, we walk among black people, they know he's one of the finest scholars we produced. Now his book, produced in the 30s, still worth reading, The Human Side of a People in Their Right Name. You probably won't get it in a good library. I got my copy, facsimile copy from the in Michigan, University of Michigan microfilm. I think it's called Union Microfilm in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I mean, they can give you a facsimile copy of almost any book that was ever published. It costs you a little money, but I mean, if you absolutely must have it, you know. But I think the Schomburg collection has an original copy. And I think the major black libraries have an original copy of this book. My point is that when the Europeans colonized Africa and the rest of the world, they colonized information about the world. And they did something else, which is disaster today to the black mind. They colonized the image of God. We are the only people who worship a God that we did not choose. Someone chose him for us and gave him to us. And this began to change at the conference at Nicaea, 225 AD. Because here is where they began to fashion the Christian religion to suit the Europeans. If you think the European is a Christian, then you misread history. The European uses religion commercially and politically. When it fails to serve him that way, he gets rid of it. The Arabs are no different in relationship to Islam. See, out of Judaism, out of Christianity, out of Islam, the great African spirituality that was turned into religions became something the African never intended it to be. The African created a God of love. They created a God of vengeance. They created a God that justified their taking over the world and their exploitation of the world. And all of them have participated in slavery one way or the other. Now, the 15th and the 16th century locked us into what Professor Van Sertima called the 500-year room. A room that stagnated and brought our history to a standstill so that you look at a curtain called slavery, but you never look behind that curtain. What were we as a people before slavery? And inasmuch as every people in the world has been slaves one way or the other, and when we arrived in the United States in a formal sense in 1619, most of the slaves were white. Why do we miss this statistic, this simple statistic? Chattel slavery had not begun, and slavery was an indentured matter. Lerone Bennett, in a book called The Shaping of Black America, has given us probably the best, the clearest chapter on that. And the chapter is called White Servitude. And the second chapter is called First Generation, dealing with the first generation of Afro-Americans who arrived and how they made out. Some became landowners, and one, well, we have a record, became slave owner and had white slaves as well as black. We do well to read Carter G. Woodson's book on the free black heads of families before 1661, and also his book, The Education of the Negro before 1861. But my point here, in looking at the African background to African American history, I want to do this graphically so that you can have some discussion on it. And I want a good, hard discussion. You don't have to spare me. I either know my business or I don't know it. And inasmuch as I've been at it longer than most of you have been in the world, over 50 years, if I don't know it by now, I should go out of business and stop pretending to people. This is the one thing I've studied. I can't fix a car. I can tell you the history of mathematics, but I cannot tell you what 9 times 9 is. Now, my main point is that looking at Africa graphically, I look at 3 golden ages. How is it that we are people who've had 3 golden ages and most people hadn't even had one? And most people had one, never had another one. Did the Greeks come back? The Romans come back? When they were through, they were through. It was over. The light went out. Didn't come back on again. Why is it that we have carried the light from the beginning, lost it and picked it up again? Now let me explain briefly what these 3 golden ages were. From the beginning of dynastic rule in the Nile Valley, and when I say Nile Valley, I don't mean just Egypt. I mean that valley that 4,000 miles long that culminated with Egypt. I mean Ethiopia, the Sudan, or ancient Kush, Punt, I mean all of that. It's the Nile Valley, not just Egypt. The Africans never called that country Egypt. They called it Tamari, they call it Kemet. The farmers generally call it Kemet. Other people call it Tamari. The ancient Hebrews call it Mizoram. The Arabs call it a name similar to that. All these were names before the word Africa came into being, into common use. The beginning of this dynastic period, about 4,000 BC, and the development of dynasties, which means nothing but families who rule, and the unification of the lower and the upper Nile, had a great leap forward during the 3rd dynasty, when African people produced something that they have been consistently producing without the world noticing it: multi-geniuses. Men whose achievement was so broad they could be qualified 10 different specialists. Like the last of the great African teachers at the University of Sankore at Timbuktu. The master teachers had to teach 10 subjects well. The graduating students lived in the master's house, and there was no such thing as a ceremonial graduation, because the student was under examination all of the time. And each one would graduate as he qualifies, not in a single collective ceremony. And the student would be questioned by the students and the master teacher. He would go on trips with them. He would examine them. What did you see? What kind of culture? What kind of people? What kind of marketplace? What kind of writing, if any? And when the student becomes proficient in understanding the culture around them, as well as the general culture, the collective decision between the master and the teachers that he's ready to graduate. So 1 or 2 students will be graduating almost every day. I'm talking about a graduating class now. Students have already had their basics. But why I'm tarrying to look at Imhotep, because he was the world's first physician. He was the forerunner of a medical doctor, and as it has been said, he was the first picture of a physician to emerge from the mist of history. He built the step pyramid, being one of the world's first great architects, one of the first people to build in stone, and he introduced the massive pyramid and temple building period. He was the real father of medicine, and the Greek, who's called father of medicine, said, I am a child of Imhotep. And why do they have an oath after him instead of Imhotep? Because they don't want the oath to come from anybody except a European. When they opened the New Harlem Hospital, I was then head of the anti-poverty program, the teaching program, and I suggested with my students that the hospital be called the Imhotep Pavilion. People thought all of us were crazy, and naturally they paid no attention to us, of course. But Imhotep set in motion that learning, that intellectual discussion that led to the development of the Great Lodge at Luxor. The Arabs call it Luxor, the Greeks call it Thebes, the Africans call it Warat. That was the first semblance of a university any place on the face of the earth. Now he left behind his stamp of intellect that gave that period a great leap forward. That was the beginning of the first golden age. All right, now, the Great Pyramid building period, now, and why I'm asking you to listen well, because there's some whole misconceptions here that a whole lot of black people are not willing to deal with because they're not willing to deal with the Bible scholarly and thoroughly. The pyramid building period generally lasts from the 3rd through the 6th dynasty. The temple in the pyramid maintenance period lasted from the 6th through the 12th dynasty. Some foreigners who said they built the pyramids didn't even arrive in Africa until the 13th dynasty. So therefore, if anybody says that they built any pyramids in Africa, you can repudiate. Then you can also read Dr. Ben's work, Black Man of the Nile and His Family. You can read, if you must read a white writer, I'll give you a good one. Gerald Massey's work, Egypt, Light of the World, 2 volumes. Book of the Beginning, 2 volumes. Natural Genesis, 2 volumes. But read his American disciple, Alvin Boyd Kuhn, and read Kuhn's work, Who is This King of Glory? In my opinion, the best book ever written on the Christ story. And it not only written on the Christ story, but good emphasis on what was stolen from Africa to make Christianity in the first place. Kuhn was not an Africanist. He was an agnostic. And he was trying to prove to the British that your religion was stolen from foreigners. And while searching for the origins of Christianity, he discovered a lot about Africa that he wasn't looking for, and spent 40 years writing this book. It was a 6-volume work. His collective essays are also available, including his most famous essay, The Historical Jesus and the Mystic Christ. The Hebrews entered Africa during the 13th dynastic period, 1700s BC. All of the pyramids had already been built. The Sphinx was already there. And if they say that they were slaves in Egypt, there is not one iota of proof any place that they were slaves in Egypt. There's no proof of it. I didn't say there was or was not. I say that thorough research has not brought us one iota of proof. They came into Africa hungry, escaping famine. They were fed. They were taken good care of. The Africans were kind, as the Africans tend to be hospitable to strangers. Even today, even strangers they should kill. When the country was invaded, 1680 BC, by people from Western Asia, Hittites, or Shepherd Kings, they did not join the African benefactors. They joined the invaders. And they rose to great height under the rule of the invaders. And during this period, they produced the world's first wheeler-dealer politician, Joseph the provider. I am saying that there is historical evidence that the stranger has never appreciated our kindness. And this is the first clear record we have of strangers coming among us, eating our bread, living in our house, sleeping with our women, without favoring us when we were in trouble and we needed them. Now, the Hittites' invasion ended the first golden age. There was a period of recovery, and during this period, a myth called the Exodus occurred. I'm using my words advisedly. I said a myth called the Exodus occurred. There was a 16-mile land bridge connecting Africa with Western Asia. Nobody had to go by sea. The people who walked in could have walked out. Now, going by sea is a beautiful story. It has no basis in fact. Now, let me go back to an African story 3,000 years before where they copied it from. Magic played a great role in the development of religions. And kings or pharaohs always took their magicians with them. So the king was feeling a little blue, a little despondent, and so his magician decided that what would help his spirit is a rowboat ride on the Nile. And so he took him in to make him still more happy. The people rowing the boat were all beautiful women. And finally the boat stopped and the lead lady started crying. And the Pharaoh asked, "What is wrong?" He said, "She dropped her necklace in the Nile." And the magician said, "Well, I'll take care of that." So he parted the water, dried up the sea, got up, walked, picked up her necklace, handed it to her. The water came back down, they rode on, she smiled, everything was all right. Now this story existed 3,000 years before the Hebrew entry. Much of what you think is the Bible were copied African stories, personified. The Africans tell animal stories. The Africans tell all kinds of stories to illustrate the truth. Now remember, this is difficult for you to understand because there's an intellectual laziness that make us think that we are sacrilege, that God going to send thunder if we question the Bible. But the Bible is a Jewish survival book, and a good one. I'm not knocking it. But I'm saying that most of it was copied from our folklore and literature that existed thousands of years before they got there. The whole concept of phallic worship was in Africa. And it was not a dirty story as Western man makes everything dirty. It was an honorable story. Man thinking that by his penis he could produce life, and he could. With a woman, of course. And he would swear on that. This is where the whole concept to testify came from. To swear on my intestine that this is the truth. Now this is folk and truth because it actually happened. All right, my main point here is that after the period that we refer to as the Exodus, and the African came back to power, the African made a proposition to the strangers. If you can obey existing African law now that we're back in power, you can stay. If not, you have to go. And just at that time, fortunately, an African born in Africa, in Goshen, and I was there last summer. It's still there, it's still in Africa. In the mountain where he's supposed to get the laws, still in Africa. We don't look at the African geography in the creation of the world's religions. Because we don't read our writers very well. I don't think many of us have read with great depth and seriousness Dr. Ben's work, African Origins of Major Western Religions, and another one, Africa, Mother of Western Civilization. John Jackson's earlier work, Man, God, and Civilization. Most of them hadn't read the white writers on it, and we have not read to a great extent. Sir James Frazier's 3-volume work, Folklore of the Old Testament. We think that if we depart from the standard approach to things, that we are sinning and somebody's going to strike us dead. But we need to examine everything. I told my students, I taught up until last semester, I told them if someone could give me some concrete proof on the Exodus, I'd give them a month's salary. I didn't give a nickel. You know how I examine it? I examine the literature of Egypt during that period to see if there's any record of large number of people leaving Egypt or Pharaoh getting drowned. There is no record at all. And yet, that was one of the best recorded periods in the history of Egypt, because the king had a pimple on his behind and made a record of it. Now, if you have a pimple on your behind and make a record of it, don't you think if 600,000 people left your country, that would be a record of it someplace? Now, let's use a little logic. There is no record in Egyptian literature and Egyptian history where they left. But we also know that an African named Moses took up with them because he was in some difficulty. And he said to them, obey my God, I be your leader. And what God did he give them? The religion of Akhenaten. Now, they say that Akhenaten gave the word monotheism, and the Jews said that they gave the word monotheism. The concept that Moses palmed off on them became part of what they interpreted as monotheism. Akhenaten didn't give the word monotheism, and neither did the Hebrews. What Akhenaten did was to correct the corrupt Egyptian ministry of that day, priesthood of that day, who were telling people you can't travel too far because you don't have my protection. It was just religious hustlerism at an early period in history. And he told them God is everywhere. God is omnipotent. God is in every living thing. And if you want to pray, pray to the wind. God is in the wind. Pray to a lowly cockroach. God is in the cockroach. But most important, God is in you. Pray to yourself. You didn't necessarily need to go to the temple. You didn't necessarily need to go to the priest. That is still true. But most people don't feel comfortable unless they go to the church or to some minister. They don't feel comfortable. But you know where my temple is? My bathroom. That's the one place I want to be able to take my time, shave and shower leisurely. I said that's one of the few pleasures left in a turbulent, uncivilized society. The right of a man to take as much time as he wants to in the morning getting out of the bathroom. Because you don't go there just for the normal sanitary reason. You take care of that anyway. But you go there, you kind of to yourself for a few moments, And nobody can enter because you got the doors locked. And you can just sit and think, you can look in the mirror and say, now, who is this guy? What I meet him from? Do I like him? What's he doing? Has he got integrity? So, having spirituality without necessarily having religion is nothing extraordinary, because man had spirituality first. I'm saying that that period was a great period of spirituality as against religions. Foreigners took the spirituality and made it into religions and put the religions against each other. Religions toned down the spirituality of mankind. Now, I'm not against anybody's religion so long as it's a spiritual thing. But I don't think Jimmy Baker has anything to do with it. I don't think Forwell has anything to do with it. I don't think that imitation black Baptist preacher who's white, who was guilty of peeping at ladies, swagger, I don't think he got to do with it. I ain't talking about nothing like that. I'm not talking about vaudeville shows. I'm not talking about religious hustlerisms. I'm talking about people who are genuinely spiritual. All of you are probably too young to remember John Haynes Holmes. He used to head the community church. One of the few white ministers that I have met that I would accept as a Christian. He was a pacifist in the First World War, pacifist in the Second World War. He was consistent. You're going to be against something, be against it all the way. Going to be for it all the way. He could preach sermons on so many things that people need to preach sermons. To think that you can't get a sermon except you get it out of the Bible. One of the greatest sermons I heard John Haynes Holmes preach was on the theme of love in the short stories of William Soroyan. I would like for people to do something on the theme of beauty, in certain work, and also on the theme of decadence and mythology. So therefore, somebody need to really preach an angry sermon on the color purple. That was a distortion of our history as a people, because they laid it in a period when we were doing so many wonderful things, building land-grant colleges, getting ourselves together, dealing with the Booker T. Washington period. Now let's go back to what ended that age was that invasion, and that invasion brought foreigners into Africa who misinterpreted Africa then and who misinterpret Africa now. But with the recovery of that period, with the beginning of the 17th and the 18th dynasty, the second golden age was underway. And this would last from the 18th dynasty until the 24th dynasty. By the 25th dynasty, Egypt had grown weak, and her cousins from the south, 3 kings, Castor, Pianki, Tahaka, came up and conquered Egypt, and the main thrust of the conquest, and black women who think they belong to white women's lib need to understand this. Because when those generals conquered Egypt, they wanted to know, do you have your house in order morally in accordance with the teachings of Maya, the last of the great female gods? Can you imagine people going to war now, wanting to know, do you have your house in order in accordance with what a woman taught? See, the Africans had already created a matrilineal system where the lineage came down through the female side of the family. In most African countries, the people are still matrilineal as against patrilineal. It hasn't heard anything. They're the first women in the history of the world to ride at the head of an army was in Africa. While Egypt produced some magnificent kings, queens, but the greatest queens were produced in Ethiopia of the Candace lines. 2 are mentioned in the Bible. One Candace told Alexander the Great, get out of Africa, and he got out. Now this takes a whole lot of romance out of it. But Alexander the Great, who was great as a diplomat, wasn't. He was a third-rate conqueror, but we Can't get into that right now because it's another lecture. He would march that magnificent Greek army to the border of a country, all their lancers and fire throwers and horses, and tell the king to come out and look at the army you got to fight. The king would cringe and give up. But when he decided to move down south, an Ethiopian queen named Candace sent 40,000 of her best soldiers to parade before him and said, if you want to come down south, I've got some more soldiers to show you. And he didn't go south. He left Africa, went to India, where he died, or thereabout, Asia, where he died in a drunken stupor, having attempted to kill his African strategist, another great African left out of history, Cletus Nigra. Of course, Cletus Nigra was the only one who would stand up against him. My main point here, graphically, is that the Iranians, one of the last of there was an attack from people called the Assyrians, now Syrians, then the Iranians, then calling themselves Phoenicians and Persians. They'll lie both ways, but that's still another matter. It was this period when the Africans cried out to their gods, if you cannot send me a conqueror who's a liberator, send me a conqueror who will show mercy. Now you can understand why this young Macedonian, Alexander, didn't have any difficulty entering Africa. He promised to show mercy, and true to his word, he did. He was still a conqueror. He was still a raper. He still raided the granary of Egypt to feed his army, but he did show mercy. And he wrote home to his mother that he had last arrived at the land where Greek culture started. The gods Zeus and Apollo had to come from Africa. He saw the evidence. Then he sent a message to one of the oracles, the great teachers, wanted to interview them and wanted to ask one question. And the oracle said, how old is this young man? About 30, 31. Tell him to return in 20 years. He might be intelligent enough to ask a question that I might want to answer. He bemoaned the fact that he did not see any of these great teachers of Africa referred to as oracles. Can you imagine a person having an apprenticeship in a school 40 years, then he's examined after 40 years to see if he has the right to continue. Then he continues till 70, then he becomes an oracle, and he goes out in the populace and dispenses his knowledge free of charge. He has no expenses because everybody considered an honor to feed him. Everybody considered an honor to make him some sandals. Everybody considered an honor to take his things from one place to another. So money is not an issue. One of the things about early spirituality in Africa, early spirituality in the world, is that money was not involved. The people wanted a temple, they built the temple. The priests wanted shoes, they got them shoes. Priests wanted bread, they delivered the bread. So was he needing money? Wanted to travel, they took him. The foreigners began to commercialize religions. An African at Syracuse, 1932, wrote a PhD thesis on why indigenous African religions never became world religions. And he pointed out, no piping, no priests, no great big temples, no great land-owning oligarchy. How are you going to become a world religion? You ain't commercializing on nothing. The priesthood and the church belong to the people, then let them support it. It's theirs. Instead of taking up money, you take up labor. All right, now, I'm going to sum this up. There is no summary, but I'm going to try to make one anyway. The Roman period, the Greek period, led to the Roman period. Now we find a European entry. For nearly 300 years, the Romans started killing Christians. And after that, strategically, on the advice of Constantine, they stopped killing Christians and became Christians. And that's why all of us were in trouble. A person who became a Christian strategically, commercially, and politically. He didn't believe it then and don't believe it now. Wouldn't live by it then, won't live by it now. Wouldn't be found dead living by something as impractical as Christianity and democracy. He would dismantle his entire society if he lived by it 24 hours. If he practiced one of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not steal, he would have to return all stolen property, he had to return you to Africa. Then what's going to happen to his economy? All right, I'm saying that the Roman mismanagement of that church caused a camel boy to start grumbling and complaining to his other camel boys. And when he asked for reform and failed to get reform, he finally had enough organization to call for a new religion, and that was Islam. Islam became a new force in the world, and what is neglected is the role of Africa in the birth of Islam. The first Mazum, Bilal, Ibn Ribat Bilal, steward, secretary, first-hand assistant to the Prophet. First military man of Islam, Zayd bin Harith, killed in the wars with the Byzantines. First literary man of Islam, Anta. Kosakov, what's the other part of his name? A Russian wrote a suite about Anta. Kerensky-Kosakov. There were many Africans in that religion, and when they were about to be driven out of Arabia, these two Ethiopians, Zayd bin Harith and Bilal, told the Prophet to send his key followers to Ethiopia until the trouble blew over. And the Prophet said that, go to Ethiopia, go to that righteous land where no one is wrong. And on his deathbed he said that Islam will never forsake Ethiopia when Ethiopia is in distress. No one ever keeps promises to us. That was one of the noblest promises ever made to us. Tragically betrayed like all promises that's made to us. No country in Africa has had more difficulty at the hands of Islam than Ethiopia. And even now. But the important thing is that except for the shelter in the haven of Ethiopia in the early period, the religion would never have come into being in the first place. I'm saying this because too many blacks go into the religion through the back door asking an Arab's permission. And they don't know that what they think of as Islam is Arabism. And they've forgotten a basic statistic. 70% of all the Arabs in the world live in Africa. There are 127 million Arabs in the world. There are more Africans in Africa who are Muslims than there are Arabs in the world. Then why are you beholden to them for the practice of this religion that you have to create in the first place? We are naive in looking at the origin of things. But with African help, Islam swept through North Africa and subsequently in the conquest of Spain, led by an African from what is now Mauritania and Senegal, Jabral Tarak Ben Azad. There's a work on him by Halle Bagiba. It is called by his name, Tarak Ben Azad. And she said that as they conquered Spain, the army was as black as ink. The general seemed blacker still. Why did the general seem blacker than the rest? He was the only one riding a white horse. This set it off. African horses were better dressed than the then kings of Europe. Halabigibo's description of the conquest is that the women were throwing their garments at his feet as he moved into Barcelona. This is only one of the many fine works written on the African and Arab occupation of Spain that is neglected. An old book is going to be republished by the Black Classics Press. Standard Land Pool's The Story of the Moors in Spain. It's going to be published. It's in preparation right now. But if you want a capsule history of it, John Jackson's work, Introduction to African Civilization, have a chapter, I think it's the fourth, called Africa and the Civilizing of Europe, dealing precisely in a condensed way with the impact of the Africans in Spain. Now, after the Crusades, the Europeans discovered, especially the tragic Children's Crusades, that they were people poor, land poor, and resource poor. They had lost the skill in longitude and latitude. In other words, they didn't even know what to do with ships. And they were looking for spices and the sweets of Asia at first. Looking for something to put on that gosh darn awful European food so they could eat it. Looking for salts. When they came down the coast of Africa, West Africa, they were not looking for slaves. They were looking for an ally. That troublesome Arab and those Islamized blacks had blocked them from the Mediterranean trade for nearly 800 years. They were looking for a king called Prester John, a Christian African king. They were looking on the wrong side of Africa. He was in Ethiopia. Then there was no such king individually as Prester John anyway, because the Ethiopians called all of their kings of substance Prester John. And so when finally the Portuguese got to Ethiopia, said, "Oh, at last we're at the kingdom of Prester John," the Ethiopians got tired of explaining this. Okay, yes. And as they got to the king, "So you're Prester John?" So I said, "Yes, I'm Prester John." In the meantime, a faker had written a letter to Europe saying, "I am the Prester John you have been talking about. I have so many ships, so many wives, so many camels, so many this." And the Prester John letter made Europe feel good about itself. At last I found an ally in Africa now. They wasn't thinking about slaves at that point. Now, the Portuguese came along the coast of West Africa, 1438, did not take any slaves out until 1442. Between 1442 and 1492, there was nothing for slaves to do. So no great number was taken out. But who opened up the world for the massive slave trade is one of the great fakers and frauds in human history, Christopher Columbus. After the murder of millions of Indians by Christopher Columbus and his thugs, he went to follow Bartholomew de las Casas to increase the African slave trade, to save the soul of the Indians. And when the Pope sent commissioners to look into this business, there wasn't one Indian on some of the islands. And they wasn't Indians in the first place. Christopher Columbus headed for the East Indies, ended up in the West Indies, and slapped the name Indian on the Caribs and the Arawaks and people of that nature. Father de las Casas' work, one of the monumental work, he's really the first historian of the New World. His work, Destruction of the Indies, was such an indictment of the Catholic Church and the Europeans. The Pope had it brought to Rome and locked it up, and for 200 years no one was permitted to read it. And if you go to a good library right now, you'll be looking at suspicious. Don't ask for the books on Bartholomew de las Casas. Ask for the books by Bartholomew de las Casas. especially his work, Destruction of the Indies. I'm saying that this destruction in the Caribbean islands of so many indigenous people made it necessary to import Africans in larger numbers, subsequently to South America, subsequently to the United States. We as a people came into a nation of immigrants. We were the immigrants against our will. We were the only people who actually were invited here. And keep this in mind. We are the only people who were invited here. We didn't come here looking for nothing. We came against our will and was forced to do something. What we did made industrial America. What we did on a world basis collectively helped Europe's economic recovery and laid the basis for the modern technical industrial world. If you think the world don't owe you something, you think again. You have to ask some serious questions. Why are other people getting reparations? Why are other people getting compensations from countries that oppress them? And why nobody even thinks about giving you anything? Because we lost something, the most precious thing a people can have is that this framework of nationhood, the responsibility of nationhood, the responsibility of international organization. We lost entrepreneurship. This is why foreigners are running the stores in our community. If any of you would go to Korea and open a store, you wouldn't get one customer. And one Korean would come in and see how crazy you are to assume that you could get a customer in his country where he's supposed to run all the stores. I think when we began again on the road back to nationhood, we will have to study three men in our history that we still misinterpret. Booker T. Washington, his concept of self-reliance, community maintenance. W.E.B. Du Bois, his concept of political maintenance. And Marcus Garvey in his concept of African redemption and reclaiming. Once we reclaim the concept of nationhood, and once we understand that Africa is 12 million square miles, and that all of it belongs to us, once we stop using words like black Africa and realize that black Africa assumes, the word black Africa assumes that that's some legitimate white Africa. Everybody in Africa who cannot be called an African is either an invader or a descendant of an invader. We not only must take back that entire continent, but we must make contact with the Africans of the Pacific, the large number of Africans in India, large number in South America, and the technical skill of the Africans living outside of Africa must reawaken Africa and begin to exploit Africa for Africa's sake. And no matter what system Africa used, it has to be made by Africans in Africa for Africans. If it's socialism, and I think it will be, it has to be a socialism designed by Africans for Africa with African culture in consideration. It cannot be, you cannot swallow European socialism and regurgitate it and think you've got an answer. You have no answer. Karl Marx was addressing himself to a European condition. He was totally ignorant of non-Western cultures. This is why the left movement is ignorant of non-Western cultures to this day. It was a mistake to say these are primitive cultures, primitive communities. There wasn't nothing primitive about it. These were advanced cultures. They were doing something you haven't done. They were taking care of people. They were making sure that people got taken care of. They had no word for jail because no one ever gone to one. Had no word for orphanage because no one ever threw away children. Had no word for senior citizens' homes because no one ever threw away grandma. Humane societies. My main point is that we gave the world its first great spirituality and its first humanity. And we're in a position now to do the same thing again. But we will have to expand the narrow concept of Pan-Africanism beyond its base to a concept of an African world union. And we have to connect with other African people in the world and be unapologetic about it. My main point is that we can change the world if at first we change ourselves. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, someone will have to field the questions for me with my advanced glaucoma. I won't see the hands anyway.
Does anyone have any questions and answers for Dr. Clarke?
Questions? I guess I'm supposed to have the answers. Okay. Yeah.
My question is this. You had touched on in the end of your presentation about Pan-Africanism and, building the world union. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I want to know from your experience, from your understanding, how do you feel about the concept of, struggle when you say, say claiming this land and building this land, that there are certain segments in our population who feel that, like B.T. Washington did say, cast down your bucket where you are,
Yeah.
and that be concerned with where you're at and build yourself right here in America, and don't be concerned, those are relative sisters, but don't be concerned about Africa, because that's over there, and we're here now.
Mm. No, there's no contradiction in what I'm saying and what he said, because sometimes the best thing you can do for Africa is what you do for yourself right here in the United States. That don't mean you have no relationship to Africa. That means Africa has a reservoir of talent to draw on it otherwise would not have. I advocate that blacks set up factories in the United States and prove to the Africans, ain't no mystery about making toothpaste. Ain't no mystery about this. He can do all of that. Colgate's is selling in Africa. I mean, let's do the basic things first. There's a skyscraper in Midtown, hurricane-proof, built by a black architect. I don't maintain that Africa needs a whole lot of skyscrapers because there's enough land. You don't have to build buildings that high. And besides, they're dangerous. But a whole architecture needs to be designed for Africa and for Africa's need, not as imitations of the West. I think although we are having a difficult time now relating to each other because we're talking to each other through the messages of whites. Once we deal directly with each other and close the door and it's just us and come, okay now brother, now we're gonna have to change your political diaper. Now let's get it together now for the best interest of all of us. I think there's a possibility. I think Booker T. Washington was preparing us to control our communities. So if you live in a brick house, you should own a brick yard. So what's wrong with that? We should have all the plumbers in our community should look like us. We're talking about self-employment of our own people. Because we can employ 1/3 of all our people immediately, just finishing goods and services to each other. All ethnic groups build a basic economics by serving each other. But now they're only building a basic economic system by serving each other. They're building a basic by serving us and doing things for us that we should be doing for ourselves. That's basically Booker T. Washington's message, and there's no contradiction between what I said and what he was saying. He did not say, don't worry about Africa. But he said, take care of home first. And once you take care of home, you will understand that home extends further than the geography of the United States. Then using the skill, you take care of one home, you take care of the other home. I'm glad you brought up the question, but I see no contradiction between the situation you analyze and the situation that in the broader situation that I address myself to. Thank you anyway.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Since you're a Harlem native, you live in Harlem yourself, and you mentioned how you mentioned about how we've lost our entrepreneurship. What do you think it would take for us, say, to get more of the businesses back, say, for example, in Harlem, from the other people, from people who have come in and set up businesses there and are providing hospice service?
But I think the church and the lodges have to encourage it, and we have to go back to collective buying. Now, if 10 black men had a grocery store, they need not compete with each other. All of them, so they can make a contract with an orange grower. We want so many oranges. They could buy the oranges before they even ripen, so that you get a break that way. If the man has so much operating capital ahead of time, he gives you a reduction. Then we can send our own trucks to Florida or to California to pick up the oranges. I mean, we can, by collective buying, we can sell to our people cheaper. And we can produce fabrics. Look, we are producing fabrics for other people. You mean to tell me we can't do it for ourselves? Who do you think working in these shoe factories? You go in the Floshine factory, there's black people that are producing Floshine shoes. You mean he can't produce a Floshine, he can't produce a shoe under black supervision? At heart, what I'm talking about is the restoration of self-confidence. The Japanese didn't have a good wheelbarrow 200 years ago, and look at them now. I'm saying you can do it if you believe you can do it. If you're going to build a train, all you need is one train. You break one train down and look at how it was put together, and you can put another one together. Go take a watch, break it down, lay it all out. Say, Joe, you produce the hands, you produce the wheels, you produce the casing. When all these different, I'm saying, don't sign to one person. All these different people produce it and put it together. They got a watch again. I think it's a lack of confidence. There are too many simple things that we can be doing for ourselves to furnish employment for ourselves that we have assigned to other people. I'm not talking about high-tech engineering, although that's important and that's something we should, of course, master. But even before we master that, before people go to a fancy technical school, there's certain basic things we could be doing for ourselves. My father worked in a brickyard and was a night supervisor of a brickyard. My father didn't go to 3rd grade, but he knew how to supervise the baking of bricks. He couldn't lecture on it, but he could get it done. Give him a crew and some help, and those bricks got in the oven, they got baked, they got taken out on time, they got loaded on the trucks on time, or loaded on the train on time. And he was a person who rarely ever lifted his voice. And yet he was a fine supervisor, a poor man who really wanted to start off his life as a sharecropper and always wanted to go back to the land. And he farmed on the side. And I remember one time between farming on the side and working in the brickyard where he made $14 a week. It seemed inconceivable to your generation. He made $18. And he lectured me on perseverance. And if you work and if you do work hard, if you obey the law and conduct yourself right, you're going to make it in this country. He believed in democracy. He didn't know it was a fake. And I thought about his $18 for many years until when I was in the Army as a sergeant major. I couldn't quiet the soldiers down, so they told me that if I didn't let them go into, they wanted to go into town to chase the ladies and bargain. And, see, a service company in the Army, this may not have much to do with, but a service company in the Army process other companies going overseas. And when you are processing a company to go overseas, all of your men must stay on post until it is finished. And it was payday, and they wanted to go up and go and visit the ladies and do their bargaining and their shopping. And not necessarily for a tie, a pair of shoes, but and they told me that inasmuch as we can't go into town, they were shooting crap, and I had to go manage the game. So I made a lot of money managing the game and didn't invest nothing, because every time someone wins 3 times, you get the third. I knew a little girl who said it was her birthday, and cute thing, but I hadn't even made it with her one way or the other. And she said, I rented a nightclub for her birthday and tipped the waiter more money, over $18. And I thought my father said, if you persevere, if you work. I said, oh no, Daddy, I've learned to be a crook for the first time in my life. And I got money in every pocket. I got to spend it before I get arrested. All right, now that may not have much to do with history, except my own.
Are there any other questions?
Dr. Clarke, I'll try to condense this question. It's really 2-part.
Okay.
I didn't grow up in the South, but from my readings and stories and whatever, and especially seeing Eyes on the Prize the other night, it seemed like we had, even with segregation, I mean, there are a lot of problems and everything, but it seemed like we created or developed a different set of problems with integration. And what happened in that transition where we had our businesses and we were more self-reliant, and after integration it seemed like we either got lazy or we felt that integration would solve things, and then somewhere in there it seems like within integration this tremendous crime element came about, and it's just taken over. And how do you feel about what happened there, and what can we do to get a hold on the thinking of a lot of young people that well, miscegenation will solve everything, and integration, will take care of things, and then nationhood is not important, so, and all that other stuff is old-fashioned and not relevant.
That's a very important question, because I think the emphasis on, I don't mean integration was a mistake, I think the emphasis in the method was a mistake. And that we thought that we had to put aside our values for other people's values. We had to neglect our house to enter someone else's house. And a lot that you call integration was just social body bumping. They didn't understand each other, and they still do not. And people do not give up power easily. Power is sweet, it's good. People just don't just give it up. Had we fought for justice, then we would have had the right to integrate or not integrate. I have the right not to associate if I don't feel like it. I got some members of my family I don't want to be bothered with. Now, you know I don't want to be bothered. There's some white people I want to be bothered with, some of them I want to avoid. I had white colleagues in Hunter. I don't want to be, I don't associate with. He's a nut, And I think we misunderstood that, and we failed to look at other people. The Jews, white women, and other minorities got more out of affirmative action than we did. And they still do. But they did not dismantle a single institution. The Jews did not say, Brandeis has to go out of business, we're integrated now. And yet you got a school in West Virginia State, now 85% white. It was an all-black school. You got integrated out of existence. And the whites used these black state schools, dumping ground for poor white teachers and poor white professors. They were on the state payroll and other schools. And it was a good reason for the predominant white schools, state schools, to get rid of them. Dump them in, because you're talking about integration and affirmative action, then that means if it's a state school, they got a right to teach at the black state schools as much as blacks. And blacks didn't resist it, and many of the able blacks teachers got pushed out in favor of these non-teaching whites. Non-teaching, and the black professors failed to even question them. Integration turned out to be a bag of worms because it told us we had to be dependent on other people other than ourselves, and we discarded too much that was ourselves, and too much we needed. I can remember the time when I would go through Harlem and have my choice of one of 10 restaurants. 3 o'clock in the morning. Restaurants there, fresh food. I don't mean you eating the leftovers from the day. That was food cooked for the night. Fresh vegetables, well served. Community basically safe. Drugs like AIDS was created to destroy us. Go back and look at the literature of the Carter administration, this Project 2000, Global 2000. They intend to get rid of 20 million of non-white people from this earth. Europeans intend to rule the world by any means necessary as long as there is a world. And there is no, when it comes to rule, there's no difference between the left and the right.
That's right.
Racism does not stop at the door of communism and socialism. It changes codes. But don't stop. This is what I mean by if you become socialist, and that's probably no other way for you except some form of socialism. It has to be fashioned by you, for you. And you have to extract what elements of capitalism you want to use. You have to do it and not have someone else force it on you. So that we need some strong, independent thinking. We need people to investigate societies that had socialism and communism before Europe had shoes or lived in a house with a window. We are too dependent on ideas that came from Europe. We have not done the independent thinking we need to do, and some of our intellects are cop-outs and basic cowards. They're split level, they're tenure, and the second car means more to them than the future of an entire people. We have to identify them and deal with them accordingly. Either you serve us or get out of our way. We have a lot of people who are in a swing position, want to know whether they're white, whether they're black, whether they come in, whether they go. We say, come in the house and stay, or go out and stay. Don't confuse people. One way or the other. If you think your white father's going to take care of you, go take a chance. No, we don't have to kill them. We don't have to kill them. Washington is run by the Light Brigade, and Atlanta is run by the Light Brigade. That's the basic problem between Julian Bond and Lewis. The black people of Atlanta had gotten tired of the rule of the Light Brigade. And they loved Julian. He's cute and all of that. The ladies admire him and all of that. He speaks well and all of that. But his kith and kin, his social kith and kin, had not delivered. Blacks want jobs done now. They want people to be forthright, speaking for them. You can't hedge now. This is the same thing is true about New York City. I don't give a damn whether they have a black mayor or not. If he's a man without any courage, I just do not have him. When two people, I think we can dump cards one way or the other. I have no problem about dumping cards, but don't dump cards and put another card in there with a black face. and let Clarke rule behind the scenes. Recently, some black man named White became president of the National or the American League. And the first thing he said, I do not represent my race. Well, fool, who do you represent? I think he should be made to go apologize to his mother, go to the grave of his father, apologize. They could have slept through that night. They didn't have to be bothered with getting him in the world. He don't the man got no respect for his mother and father. Do you think Joe DiMaggio would say that? The Italians are proud of Joe DiMaggio. DiMaggio knows that. He don't have to proclaim nothing. All he have to do is to be Joe DiMaggio and not conduct himself in any way that brings shame on the Italians. And he represents the Italians. He don't have to say it. He is. He just is it. But why do we feel called on to say that we don't represent our race? Why do we have a famous novelist who said that I'm not a Negro novelist, I'm just a novelist who happened to be a Negro. Oh my God. I said, what the hell? Look, I've written a lot of fiction. If I write a fiction story about whites, some of my blackness is part of it. It's a part of it, part of the totality. Because I don't deny myself, I bathe in it.
Thank you. All right. Thank you.
This is why Adam Powell was so effective. He could pass for white any place in the world. And he not only bathed in blackness, he smeared in people's face. That's why he got on the nerves of those whites down in Congress, and they had to get rid of him. They just couldn't stand a man from Harlem having his nerve and not afraid of any of them. And we have made not the proper assessment of his career. He probably used less than 1/10 of his talent. He was still the best politician we sent to Washington.
That's right.
Had he used 100% of his talent, God. Now let's just dream a little bit. What would Adam have done in Jesse Jackson's position? He'd have turned this nation around. He would say, I will stay in the Democratic Party irrespective. He said that, now if I don't get my way, now I'm going to pull the house down. I'm going to take my father and go. All of it, all history is a current event, and everything that ever happens continues to happen. So it's impossible to even talk about ancient history without eventually talking about the here-ness and in the now-ness. I think we're in a golden political position, we're a golden cultural position, but we've not made the best use of the things we have. And when other people are showing their cultural and historical wares in the marketplace, we have not shown enough of ours.
Questions right back here.
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Whoever.
Regarding African Americans, Dr. Clarke, how would you advise college students who say, I'm an American, I just happen to be black, I can look in the mirror and see I'm of African descent, but Africans don't like us and we don't like them, and some college students have never met an African, or if they've reached out to the African, they may not have had good personal experience.
Well, that approach is the worst approach you can make. If you have never met an African, go and meet one. And to say that, look, when you say that you're an American, not an African, no German would say, I'm a German, I'm an American, not a German. He has no problem with saying I'm a German American. And there was an argument in my class, one of the semesters, between the Africans, the Afro-Americans, and the Caribbeans. And the class was over Lexington Avenue. I said, I want one by one, go down and count the number of taxis that pass before one picks you up. An average of 21 cabs pass without picking up any one of those people, but all with black faces. Then I picked one of the white girl students. I said, you go down and see how many cabs passed before you picked up. She was on her way to the sidewalk, and her hand wasn't her hand wasn't all the way up. She was just raising it. She didn't get it all the way up. 3 cabs stopped. I said, sit down now. All of you have failed the taxi cab test. You might pass some of my midterm exams, but you failed the taxi cab examination. That bigoted cab driver, in his negative way, is a better Pan-Africanist than all of you.
All right.
I said, this may be hard, and I pointed to the white girl student. I said, that is a citizen. You are subjects.
Thank you.
There's a difference between being a citizen and a subject. You were not brought here to be citizens.
Never.
You were brought to be subjects, and that's all you are. When that cab driver refuses you, he don't have to feel guilty. He don't accept you as a human being and a citizen in the first place. But if we say to ourselves, we will be in spite of it, and we will reclaim ourselves as a human being and pull all African people together, tell them to feel proud of themselves. We should begin by looking at a mirror and see if we do you like what you see? I think the idea of saying I'm an American other than an African is self-defeating and serves us no good at this critical juncture in our history. I think we have enough to offer ourselves, enough to offer the world to be both. No one is denying that you're an American. You were here a year before those people who came over on the Mayflower. You built the railroads. You cleared the forests for the farms. You got a better claim on America than any other immigrant group. I'm not denying any of that. But you're also of African origin. And your original claim, and your original cultural incubator was African. And you can never leave that.
There's a question in the back.
Yes.
Hi, John. I wanted to ask a question. Some of my friends, we were discussing the fact that just beginning in the semester, they've been offering a lot of courses about blacks, related to black fishing classes.
Black what now?
Black literature classes.
Middle classes.
Literature.
Oh, I understand now.
And particularly also African civilization class. And they were all taught by people of a Caucasian background.
Henry Hull. Richard Hull.
Richard Hull.
I know him. I've encountered him. And I'll reserve my comment.
In class and also outside of class, we were discussing, the fact that, hey, wouldn't this be funny if there was a Caucasian guy teaching this class? And then he walked in. I wanted to know your opinion about Caucasians teaching that kind of class. In my own opinion, I see that there's too many of them teaching us about ourselves. And I think that's only detrimental to the cause, but I also wanted your opinion on that.
I have no objection if he knows the subject. And I found very few who know the subject well enough to bring to it the depth of intellectual understanding that the subject needs. I would have no problem with Basil Davison teaching it. But I would have, now this is delicate, I would have some problem with Ali Mazarui.
Oh, yeah.
Because Ali Mazarui is a cultist Muslim who intend to vindicate Islam by any means necessary. I do not think a white person can teach African history from an Afrocentric point of view. I believe Basil Davison can teach it from an honest historical point of view. He's still a white man teaching it, although he is probably the best in the field. And I can accept his work, and I've leaned on his work a great deal and use it for reference. I would not use the work of Robert July. because Robert July is not only naive, he's inaccurate. Richard Hull's work is a novelty. It's kind of a dilettante, interesting journey into Africa. Some concepts are not based on facts, but, you know. His subject matters are good, but his minding of the subject matter leaves a lot to be desired. There's still a few black master teachers of the subject. And I maintain that any teacher can teach anything if he learn it well enough and bring something to it that's of insight that wasn't there before. I'm not against white teachers as teachers. I'm against them teaching our subjects before they have time to learn it and develop a feeling toward it that they develop toward their history. And somewhat a partiality in understanding it that other whites don't have. See, when whites begin your history with slavery, you can know immediately that that's not your teacher. I can't prevent them from teaching these subjects. You can't either. I believe there's a few whites who teach black literature fairly decently, and a few who know it. I think Robert Bone up at Columbia is not one of them, because he's arrogant and know-it-all. And I'm tired of big white fathers who never met my mother.
Dr. Clarke,
Yes, sweetheart.
doesn't it really speak to the fact that blacks are not getting through the tenure process? And of course, anybody can teach anything, but more importantly, we need to create and continue to create a group of black intellectuals who are teachers, and they only do that in this system by going through the whole tenure process. And I find that that is where we're not getting through. So you open the door when you're talking about a number of brevity of jobs. Part of the problem is they are getting those jobs because we're not getting through the system.
Well, because the system is rigged. See, having been chairman of a department sitting on tenure committees, I know it's rigged. It's rigged ahead of time, and they only want so many of us tenured. And generally, too many blacks who are tenured are worthless to black people.
Thank you.
Now, while I was chairman, I said that we should have somebody at Hunter College teaching something other than black history. A black man teaching some other. So I brought in a botanist. I voted for him. And we tenured him, but he'd worked for private industry, worked in university. We tenured him at the door. I met him in the hallway because some of his students black students began to complain to me. This man is setting the class up to almost to the benefit of the white students. I asked him, what are you doing in your class on Emmett Jott? Ernest Jott. He said, who is Ernest Jott? Here's a black man teaching bottomists, never heard of the greatest black botanist this country has ever produced. Never heard of him. No knowledge of great black scientists in the natural sciences. Then he hadn't spoken to me since. Hadn't spoken to me since. Now, if a black man is teaching a subject where other black men pioneered, then they should, I'm not saying ignore the other people, but should at least know the black man. Judd read papers in Germany in German. When he went to France to read a paper, he read it in French. The whole cell biology, the whole concept of cell analysis was taken to a great extent from the researches of Judd. This is what Percy Julian used in his researches on the Sawyer bean. for a black man to make that kind of contribution and to be called the black Apollo of science and to be unknown to another black man teaching his subject is just unforgivable. I was so unnerved. I went to my office and just closed the door. Shook my head for 10 minutes. Sorrow. Sorrow. Then every time, see, they were bringing black professors on out of the line of the salary line. I mean, there was no line for them. But because you had a female president who was a dynamo, who had gone to school with black men, who had respected black men as thinkers, seemed to respect them more as thinkers than lovers. Because some people can respect you as a lover and bring you in for that service. But this woman seemed to have a great deal of respect for black men as thinkers. Because she had gone to Syracuse with Ron Walters, Rudy Lombard, all these tough, these heady black men who really got it on the ball, you know. And so she had tuned herself well politically. And so when I threw out the proposal, let's bring some black men on in capacities other than black studies, in the sciences. And she picked him. I regretted that I had voted for it, but my vote and the votes that I had in my pocket helped to sway it. I mean, like Adam Powell, I don't want to go into a meeting. I got the votes I needed in my pocket before I go into the meeting. You don't go to the meeting and solicit no votes. You do your soliciting before the meeting starts. That's good politics. So I knew I had the votes. When I feel a little wasted on him. He's still there. But black professors who think that they don't relate to black people because they don't teach black subjects, it's kind of hard for me to deal with. You didn't resign from us, you came anyway. I think, first place, we have to strengthen the predominantly black colleges. Strengthen them. And which does not mean that you are to go to them and them alone. You go where you please. But you are stronger outside of them because they are strong. Because that's an institution what we at least supposed to control. That's the institution where we can set a tone in the teaching of literature that we can't set other places. That's where we can have a specific curriculum. We can't set other places. And all of this is training for a black cadre to come into the predominantly white control school.
Another question right in the back.
Yeah. I think the support of our economic aspects goes hand in hand with re-educating our youth, many of whom lack or are resistant towards acknowledging that link to their African culture. I used to work in a boys' club, and I saw that many of the kids there lack the sense of confidence that knowledge about their culture could impart. And also, it's a particularly trying time because we're seeing that a lot of our slow progress that we've made so far are being revoked. I'd like to have your opinions on the recent Supreme Court decision on affirmative action in Richmond, Virginia, and what that signals.
That signals a return to conservatism on the court, and Thurgood Marshall by himself can't swing that court. No, see, Brandeis couldn't swing the court, but Brandeis had another Jewish partner named Frankfurter. And together, they didn't say we don't represent the Jews. They looked after the interests of the Jews without ever saying they don't represent. That's the worst thing you can say. I don't, go do it. We produce a society where man did not say, I'm my brother's keeper. He just kept him. I think the decision, that Virginia's decision, is beginning of a bold retraction, a regression of the gains of the civil rights movement. And that court was appointed to do that job. We have to start the fight all over again because we did not put enough political flow and definition under the fight so that we could move to the next step forward. We could be pushed back because we did not even explain to young people the political meaning of what you're doing. And many of them came out of the movement and betrayed the movement because they did not have a locked-in definition of where the movement was supposed to go. I hired a number of them as teachers in my program at Hunter, only to discover that they were looking more after themselves than the students. And they were, while they were proclaiming blackness, they weren't living any of it.
We have time for one more question.
Dr. Clarke, sir, how do you suggest that we as young African Americans try to regain our peers out there in the street? It seems like that would be the prerequisite to us casting down our buckets pretty much in the image of Booker T. Washington, or either networking with our brothers and sisters across the two oceans. How would you...
This is going to be difficult because your peers out in the street who's probably making more selling crack than some college professors will ask you, can you duplicate this money? And you can't, of course. Can you explain to him that it's not necessary for you to do that in order to give him some kind of a leadership? I think you should not take on the total responsibility yourself, although one-to-one connections are absolutely necessary. I think we need to look around and pull strength from the total community and the people who have the attention of the community, the ministers and etc. I think there's too many people drawing funds and other resources from our people who are not responsible for getting a message across. I think up until the end of the 19th century, the church was a credit. In the 20th century, I think it takes more than it gives back, and it's now a debit. Maybe I don't answer the question, but I think what we need examples out there, and I'm not necessarily talking about charismatic leaders. I think a charismatic program might do more in the long run than a charismatic leader. One thing about charismatic leaders, they're generally handsome and they spend so much time saying yes to temptation. They generally get killed too soon. God, what would we do today if we had the voice and the mind of a Malcolm X? Hallelujah. Or an Nkrumah, or in spite of all of the negative aspect of nonviolence, a King still. Because we will never know where King was going because he was cut down while he was still growing. We will never know what kind of man he could have been or would have been because he was moving progressively toward revolution. Anytime you question the nation's participation in the Vietnamese War, threatened to lead a poor people's march in Washington, poor blacks and poor whites, that's political power. And he might have been in a political crossfire or on a collision course with other political forces. But he was going to be higher than what he was had he lived to be. He was increasingly challenging the economic system of this country, the social system of this country, and the educational system of this country. You cannot measure King solely because of by nonviolence. And you cannot measure Malcolm X solely in his relationship with Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad also needs a reappraisal. He made a more meaningful contribution than we think. You don't have to be a Muslim to understand that Elijah Muhammad created a concept of self-confidence in black people that made a whole lot of them whole again. A whole lot of people coming out of prison brushed themselves up and became human beings worthy of society again. And I used to go to the mosque myself, and the one thing that I loved most to see the brothers step back and let the ladies pass and get them seated, you know, before they got seated, or stand when the lady needs the seat. That was a beautiful thing. We were becoming a family again. We were becoming considerate of the women that gave us birth, or the women who must give birth to a generation still to come. I may not have answered the question, and maybe I don't have an answer, but I'm still searching for a better answer. No matter what answer I give, I'm searching for a better answer. We must find a way to communicate with the young. When he said his peers, he means people of his own age group. And he can do it better than we can do it, because I think if they're going to listen to anyone, they would listen to someone of that age group. It's a pity that Michael Jackson mutilated himself and tried to be white. He was a handsome young man. He was black handsome. Good full lips and good nice shade of brown, you know, fine smile, you know. There was nothing wrong with it. Absolutely nothing in the world wrong with that boy's face. Now he got a thin nose. I wonder how he breathed out of it. He's the color of a ghost. Until we like what we see in that mirror, we're in trouble. We not only need better national examples, we need better international examples. All right, I've enjoyed this evening with you. If you have no more questions.
Therefore, on the behalf of the Black Business Students Association and the Black History Committee, we would like to thank Dr. Clarke for coming this evening and lecturing us and showing us that Black history is truly the essence of the world and this nation. Thank you.
Yeah, oh no. This is my colleague. We came over to hear from you. This is Dr. Hughes, Clarence Hughes. We worked together at NYU. And he was taking copious notes. You were marvelous as usual. Okay.
I forgot to bring.
Oh.
They're still editing those things out. When you have time, I want to get back to them unedited cassettes.
Okay, I'll drop it. I'll drop it off.
I'm jumping about, you know, this got coming.
Oh my goodness.
I had enough eyesight to see that finish 2 books.
Oh, great. But you think it's just...
That is something I couldn't read my first today.
Now listen, I have the I do it. Well, why don't I send them UPS and make sure you get them? I could do that. I could do that. I can take care of that tomorrow.
Out of the house. I'm in and out of the house. Tomorrow I'm going to sleep at 5.
Oh, you are?
I don't know whether to give up milk at 5 or not.
Not yet. My daughter's still in there.
If I'm asleep at 9 Street, what they do is most of the street.
I know. Oh, yes, I had them. We were reading about 3 or 4 grades above grade levels. I went to schooling in District 5 and I ran in. But I'm worried about those cassettes. I looked at them, as a matter of fact, 2 days ago. Yeah, well, they need a lot of editing, and I made my dinner, but they kept saying they were going to edit them. So I'll get them to you.
They're being edited now. And there's a second, Shasha McIntyre is going to take an essay on music. I don't think.
I don't really know why. I went with Dr. Van, and I told everybody, don't go to this, don't go to this.
It's almost like a circular question. So I see the essence of the question. Why do we instill that concept of family amongst our brothers and sisters? Because like all of us aren't like this. That's eye-opening, right?
Because I look to you. Yeah, they look, like every time I go out of the country, they go in there. So I'm looking through that book, I'm getting nervous.
Another battleship to pay for.
Yeah.
Another
That's right, that's right.
John Killer the last 10 years of his life. Last 10 years. Now they're on me.
But it's a fun.
I went there.
Yeah.
$100. And they still came back and said, I don't know. I don't know about that man from Christmas.
I know, but once they start on you, and they got your name in that book and your activities, this is one way of curbing your activities. That's what it is.
But the doctor, man, but I do like this school. Just kind of
Yeah, but he was handling John Henrik's Clarke's account. I'm sure if they do. I'm sure they've read all your books. They got that little age. That's right. They got it. That's right.
And they figure they can use you without causing no trouble.
Our problem is now you can't let it worry you because you got to stay well. You got you got all this contribution out here to make.
After I had this story, how many books I have?
Yeah, but you're done already.
2 books of short stories, 2 books of short stories I wrote when I was a student here at NYU.
Oh no. Are you going to be coming out?
True college. A complete novel about 4 boys living in the South, in Chicago, and subsequent to New York. Journey to the Fair. The best work I've ever done in the picture. I didn't think I'm at
All right. That's right. Stop talking about it. That's our national church.
Call me when you might have lunch on Friday.
Okay, good.
I'm not one of them.
They have
Marley, can you read your unforgivable thing? Because it's Marley. We're all supposed to lift up arms against another Marley.
Yes. Everything within the faith is capacitor. Everything outside of it is the wall zone. I agree with it, but be consistent about it. At least you got a frame of reference.
No Muslims ever supposed to lift up arms against another Muslim.
How do you classify
Those Muslims, Arabs, as the most corrupt element within Islam.
And they're from African origin anyway.
There
are some black Arabs.
I've seen some black. You know, the blackest Arabs I saw was in the Emirates.
Yeah,
Several rich nations there behind Iran.
Yeah, around the middle. Yeah.
United Arab Emirates. I met black Arabs. They don't mention a word out. Emirates told me when they was announcing all the conferences came out, 2-3 telephone calls, telex. The black Arabs in charge of communication called me and said, brother, that wasn't for you. You can call anybody in the world you want to and send a telex to any place in the world so long you see how to do it. I'll take care of you, brother. You person. That's for the other people. Come to you, you do what you please. And I went down the next morning. He said, did you go to the marketplace? I'm trying to get out of it now because if you see one marketplace, you've seen 1,000. I'm trying to say that, well, you know, I sort of kind of rest up. He said, you should go to the marketplace, you know. I said, well, I don't have any transportation. Now, what I would say that? You clap your hands. 3 cars! 3 cars!
You know what I'm saying? You know you don't have anything to get out of these streets. But how do you do that?
Call me one day if you come by the next day. If I'm in town, you can just come by. You know. Okay now. Take care of yourself. Okay.
I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
I have a small little question.
This was you? Yes. Good. Alvin Lloyd Cuban. All right. How much they go for? He was one of the American disciples of Gerald. Appreciate it. Take care, bro. Gerald Massey wrote Egypt Light of the World, 2 volumes, Natural Genesis, 2 volumes, and Book of the Beginning, 2 volumes. Alvin Lloyd Cuban. Now there's a place in San Jose called Health Science something that sells a lot of reprints of old books, but they kind of loose stitch. And you know, I just don't like a book that way. I like a notebook that way, but I just don't, you know. It don't mean as though the pages might get torn out or something. Snatch them out.
I was so amazed at how much I remember. And I look at myself and the kind of classes I've taken, you know, it's all the same thing over and over again, even in this school. And you know, that's why hopefully we can copy down almost every book we live with, so maybe I can expand my own knowledge in history. That was very exciting.
When I was here, saw Bella who won the Nobel Prize. I don't think he's good. He was one of my teachers.